Picture this. You are utterly alone. The endless, cracked earth of the Badlands stretching out to a horizon that bleeds into a bruised purple sky. In your arms, a child is dying. He is not yours. His skin is fever-hot, his breath a fragile whisper against your cheek. And on the ridge above your small, desperate homestead, 200 warriors have appeared. Their forms are carved from the dying light, stark and silent, spears and bows etched against the sunset. They are the boys' people, and they have come for an answer. They see a stranger with their stolen son, and their faces are masks of grief turned to stone-cold fury. Every instinct screams at you to run, to flee into the gullies and disappear. But you know you would be cut down before you took 10 steps. So what do? Do you stand your ground, clutching the small, fading life that has become your death sentence, and face the coming storm? This was the choice that fell to Alara. Her life had already been burned to the ground once. She was a widow, a ghost haunted by the memory of her husband, a good man who had dared to speak truth to power in a town rotten to its core. The town's mayor, a man named Elias Thorne, ruled with a ledger in one hand and a hired gun in the other. He saw land and people not as living things, but as assets to be acquired or liquidated. When Alara's husband refused to sell their small farm, Thorne had foreclosed with fire and bullets. Alara had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart hollowed out by loss, pushing west until civilization frayed into wilderness. She had found this place, a crumbling stone cabin tucked into a shallow canyon, a forgotten remnant of some other hopeful soul. Here, the silence was a balm, the stark beauty a catechism. The land was harsh, but it was honest, and for the first time in a year, she had begun to feel the phantom weight of Thorne's shadow recede. She had learned the rhythm of the sun, the language of the wind, and the secrets of the tough, resilient plants that clung to life in the unforgiving soil. The storm came without warning, a monstrous wall of ochre dust that turned the mid-afternoon sun into a sickly orange smudge. It clawed at her cabin, shrieking through the cracks in the stone, a physical manifestation of the world's fury. When it finally passed, leaving the air thick and tasting of grit, Alara stepped outside to survey the damage. And that is when she found him. A small boy, no older than 8, half buried in a fresh dune of red sand. He was dressed in simple buckskin, his dark hair matted with dirt. He was unconscious, his body limp as a rag doll. At first, she thought he was gone, another life claimed by the merciless land. But then she saw the faint flutter of his chest and felt the terrifying heat radiating from his skin. On his calf, 2 small puncture wounds were surrounded by an angry, swollen purple that crept sickeningly up his leg. A rattlesnake. She didn't hesitate. The thought of who he was or where he came from was a distant echo behind the immediate, overwhelming need to save him. He was a child, alone and dying. That was the only truth that mattered. Lifting him into her arms, she carried his frighteningly light body back into the sanctuary of her small cabin. She laid him gently on her own cot, the only soft place in the entire dwelling. For the next 3 days, the world shrank to the space of that single room. Time was measured not in sunrises, but in the boy's ragged breaths. She worked with a desperate, focused intensity. She lanced the wound, her hand steady despite the tremor in her soul, and drew out what venom she could. She crushed yarrow and echinacea, herbs her grandmother had taught her to identify, and made a poultice to fight the poison and a tea to break the fever. She bathed his face with cool water, murmuring soft words she wasn't even aware she was speaking. They were words of comfort, fragments of old lullabies, quiet confessions to this silent witness. She told him about her husband's smile, about the farm they had lost, about the hollowness inside her. In the oppressive silence of the Badlands, she poured her own grief into the small, still form on the cot, as if her sorrow could somehow anchor his fleeting spirit to the world. The cabin, once a refuge from her past, became a fortress against death itself. Slowly, miraculously, the tide began to turn. The deep purple of the snakebite began to recede, and the volcanic heat of his fever lessened to a low burn. He remained unconscious, but his breathing deepened, growing stronger, more regular. A fragile, trembling hope began to take root in Alara's exhausted heart. It was on the evening of the fourth day, as the sun began its spectacular death throw across the western sky, that they came. Alara was sitting by the boy's side, changing the dressing on his leg, when a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up and her blood ran cold. Standing on the ridge overlooking her cabin, silhouetted against the crimson sky, was a warrior. And then another and another until the entire ridge was lined with them. 200 men, sitting on their horses as still as the ancient rock formations around them. They were an army of ghosts returned to claim their own, their faces grim, their intent radiating across the distance like a palpable wave of heat. Fear, sharp and primal, seized her. But then she looked down at the boy, at the gentle rise and fall of his chest, and a different feeling rose to meet the fear. A fierce, defiant protectiveness. She had not brought him this far only to lose him now. She rose slowly, her body aching with fatigue, and stood in the doorway of her cabin, her small figure framed by the light within. She would not run. She would not cower. She would be the guardian of this small flame she had so painstakingly shielded from the wind. A man detached himself from the silent host on the ridge. He was clearly their leader, his presence carrying an authority that needed no announcement. He rode down the slope, his movements fluid and controlled, his eyes fixed on her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of profound sorrow and simmering rage, etched with lines of hardship and responsibility. He dismounted before her cabin, his gaze sweeping past her to the cot inside, where his son lay. The flicker of recognition in his eyes was instantly consumed by a fire of suspicion. To him, the scene was an indictment. His missing child, lying in the bed of a white woman, the very people who had brought so much pain to his tribe. He was Chief Black Wolf, and he had followed the trail of his son, Little Hawk, with a heart vacillating between hope and despair. Now, seeing him here, he feared the worst. He uttered a sharp command in his own tongue, and another warrior, a younger man with eyes that held a weary knowledge of her language, stepped forward to translate. "He asks what you have done," the translator said, his voice flat. "He asks why you have stolen the son of the chief." Alara looked directly at Black Wolf, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried the clear, resonant timbre of truth. "I stole no one," she said, her words simple and direct. "I found him in the sand after the dust storm. He was dying. A snake had bitten him." She gestured toward the boy's leg, then pointed to the herbs laid out on her small table. "I have been trying to save him." Black Wolf's eyes narrowed. These were just words, and the words of her people were often laced with poison and deceit. He strode past her into the cabin, his presence seeming to shrink the small space. He stood over the cot, his massive frame casting a shadow over his son. He looked down at Little Hawk's face, still pale but peaceful in his deep sleep. He saw the carefully cleaned and dressed wound on his leg. He saw the bowl of used poultice and the cup of healing tea on the crate beside the bed. He reached down and laid his hand, calloused and strong, on his son's forehead. The skin was still warm, but the raging fire of the fever was gone. It had been replaced by a gentle, healing heat. He looked at the exhaustion etched onto Alara's face, the genuine fear and desperation in her eyes, and he saw not a thief, but a guardian. The answer he had come to demand was not one of words, but of action and intent. And it was here, in the quiet, desperate care she had given his child. The warrior's suspicion did not vanish, but it was now at war with a dawning, reluctant respect. The tribe did not leave. They made a temporary camp in the canyon, a silent, watchful presence. It was an uneasy truce, suspended in the space between suspicion and gratitude. The tribe's medicine woman, an old woman with eyes as ancient as the hills, came to the cabin. She examined Alara's work, nodding slowly as she smelled the herbs and touched the healing wound. Without a word, she began to work alongside Alara, applying her own knowledge, her own remedies. A silent understanding passed between the two women, a shared language of healing that transcended culture and suspicion. Chief Black Wolf returned to the cabin several times. He would stand for long moments, simply watching his son breathe. One evening, as Alara sat outside, watching the stars begin to prick the velvet darkness, he came and sat on a rock nearby. "He is my only son," Black Wolf said, his voice a low rumble. The translator was gone. The chief spoke in halting, carefully chosen English. "His mother walks the spirit road. If I lose him, I lose the sun from my sky." Alara's heart ached with a familiar pain. "I know that loss," she whispered, her gaze distant. "A man of great greed and no honor took my husband from me. He took our home. He took my son from the sky, too." In that shared confession of grief, a fragile bridge was built between them. They were not red and white, not man and woman, but two people who understood the shape of the hole a loved one leaves behind. A few days later, a scout reported seeing a rider watching the canyon from the high plains, a lone figure who disappeared when spotted. A cold knot of dread tightened in Alara's stomach. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who it was. The past was not as buried as she had hoped. The next morning they came. Mayor Elias Thorne, flanked by a dozen rough-looking men with rifles resting easy in their saddles. Thorne was a man whose softness was a lie. His jowly face and expensive suit could not hide the predatory hardness in his eyes. He rode straight to her cabin, a smirk of triumph on his face. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in," he drawled, his eyes sweeping over her with possessive arrogance. He then noticed the Lakota camp, and his smirk widened into a sneer. "Playing house with the savages, Alara? I always knew you had low tastes," he dismounted, pulling a rolled document from his coat. "This is all very touching, but it's time to go. According to this deed, legally filed and stamped, this entire canyon, including the spring that feeds it and this pathetic little hovel, belongs to me. I'm claiming my property." Alara felt the old fear, the familiar sense of helplessness in the face of his corrupt power. But then she felt something else. She looked at Little Hawk, now sitting up in the cot and watching with wide eyes. She looked at the stoic faces of the warriors who had begun to drift closer, their hands resting near their weapons. She was not alone anymore. She straightened her back and lifted her chin. "This paper is as worthless as the soul of the man who holds it," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "You own nothing that is earned with blood and lies." Thorne's face darkened with rage. The woman who had fled his town in terror was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize. "You have nothing, Alara. I own the law. I own this land. And I should have made sure I owned you," he snarled. "But I'll settle for watching you crawl away from here with nothing, just like before." He turned to his men. "She wants to be a hero? Fine. Burn it. Burn it all to the ground. If I can't have this land, no one will." As Thorne's thugs dismounted, pulling torches from their saddlebags, a silent, human wall formed before them. Chief Black Wolf and 50 of his warriors stepped forward, moving with a fluid, unnerving grace. They created a living barrier between Thorne's men and Alara's cabin, their faces impassive, their eyes holding a promise of swift, lethal violence. They held no rifles, only bows and spears and knives, but they radiated an ancient, unshakable power that made the hired guns hesitate. Black Wolf took a single step forward, his gaze locking onto Thorne's. "This woman showed honor when your heart showed only greed." The chief's voice was low, yet it carried across the canyon, each word a stone dropped into a still pool. "She protected my son. Now we protect her home. This land is under the protection of the Lakota people. You will leave now, or your bones will bleach in this canyon beside those of the rattlesnake." The air grew thick with tension. Thorne's men looked at the warriors, then at their boss. They were paid to bully farmers and intimidate widows, not to fight a war with men who had everything to lose and were not afraid to die for it. They saw no fear in the Lakota eyes, only a profound and dangerous certainty. Thorne, a coward at his core, saw it too. His bluster evaporated. replaced by the rat-like cunning of survival. He spat on the ground, his face a mask of impotent fury. "This isn't over," he hissed, but his words were hollow. He climbed back on his horse and, with a final hateful glare, led his men away in a cloud of dust and humiliation. The evil had been driven back not by a great battle, but by a greater resolve. In the silence that followed, Alara felt tears finally well in her eyes, not of fear or sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude. Little Hawk, now standing on wobbly legs, came to her and took her hand. His small fingers wrapped around hers, a bond of trust and affection. Black Wolf approached her, the fury in his eyes replaced by a deep, abiding respect. "My son called you Woman of the Stone House," he said. "But my people will call you Sister. You are not alone anymore." Alara looked from the chief's solemn face to the small boy holding her hand, to the dozens of warriors who were no longer a threat, but a shield. She looked at her humble cabin, which had nearly been her pyre and had instead become the anchor of a new life. It was no longer just a sanctuary from her past, but a bridge to an unimagined future. She had fled from the ruins of one family and, in the harshest place in the world, had found another. We are often told that family is born of blood, of shared heritage and history. But what if true family is forged in fire? What if the unbreakable bonds are the ones we choose, the ones sealed not by birthright, but by a shared stand against the darkness? The world can be a desolate and unforgiving place, a badlands of the heart where it seems easier to build walls than to open doors. But as Alara discovered, even in the deepest wilderness, a single act of compassion, of unwavering courage, can be enough to build a home and call a family into being. What would you have done in her place? When faced with fear and suspicion, would you have turned away? And more importantly, what will you do the next time you see someone in need, alone and facing their own storm? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story of courage moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unshakable human spirit.